Alright guys, so today I'm going to be showing you my Predator's Mark 4-piece hunting build. It's mainly used in the DZ, utilizes 4-piece Predator, the specialized backpack, and the Barrett's chest. But that being said, the Barrett's chest piece is not essential, so I don't want anyone getting the wrong impression. You do not need to have this item. It can function very well with a variety of high ends, and I'll talk about that over the course of the build. I'm going to go over all my different pieces of gear, all the different stat points. I'll talk about my weapons, how I've modded them. I'll go to my skills, my talents, and then I'll kick it over to some gameplay. First up, we have this Predator's Mark mask. Now, I think it's a really cool looking mask, but that's kind of beside the point. And there's a very specific set of attributes that you want on here. Now, I've started off with a very high firearms roll. You want to aim for over 1250 if possible, but over 1200 as a baseline. The composition of the build, very quickly, is actually going to be 3-piece firearms, 2-piece stamina, though some people may opt for a different composition with only 2-piece firearms and 3-piece stamina. That is also viable. But the main thing right now is to note that we have a balanced composition between firearms and stamina and high toughness. Now, specifically for the mask, I have a great firearms roll. I have critical hit chance and enemy armor damage. Now, some people may opt to have health or skill power on the mask, and both of those will work. But another thing to note is that the Predator's Mark 4-piece, and this is the most important part of the set in my eyes, hit 10 shots without switching targets to make the target bleed for 50% of damage already done by those bullets. Heavily relies on the amount of damage that you can deal to make that bleed relevant. Not only is there utility in the bleed in order to slow the target down, but there's also raw damage in that bleed. So getting those crits and having additional crit hit chance, even while using an assault rifle, as I'm choosing to do, that has very high base damage, is going to allow me to sometimes achieve upwards of 10,000 base damage on that bleed per tick against enemy players, and that is a tremendous amount of damage. So that's something very important to know. And then it's also extremely important to have enemy armor damage as the minor attribute. That is absolutely the best in slot on the mask, and you're absolutely going to be running that in PvP in a variety of situations. Next up, we have our Predator's Mark Kneepads. This is a fairly straightforward item in any build now, especially those utilized in PvP. What you're going to have is a high main stat roll of your choice. I have 1233 firearms. You're going to have armor as a major attribute, and always look for enemy armor damage in the minor attribute slot. Paired on top of an assault rifle, it becomes increasingly effective, and it's something that everyone should be pursuing in PvP builds. Next up, we have this Predator's Mark holster. Very straightforward item in any build. You want the highest main stats possible and armor in the major attribute slot. I've got a really great roll here. I would consider this a god roll. It's got decent armor. It's got a great firearms roll, over 1250 in all 3 attributes. A really solid pickup for this build. Last up for our Predator's Mark gear, we have these Pred Mark gloves. Now, it's important to note that these are not rolled optimally. However, they do have a very good armor roll at 981. They have a decent stamina roll at 1234. And then for major attributes, they have assault rifle damage, which is the critical component, and you absolutely need this, especially when running an assault rifle. If you do opt to switch over to an SMG, you would switch that out for SMG damage. They have health on kill and critical hit damage. I would much prefer health on kill to be critical hit chance, as this would allow me, again, to proc a stronger bleed at times, and thus deal more damage, residual damage over time to players. As well as NPCs, but mostly to players. This is going to be a PvP-centered build. It does have utility in PvE, but that's not the main focus. So health on kill, the critical hit chance is a positive change. The god roll top 3 would be main weapon damage of the gun of your choice, critical hit damage, and critical hit chance. But this does fulfill the purposes of the build. Moving on to our 2 high-end pieces, we have this backpack, and I have opted to run specialized on it. Now, 200% of firearms and stamina to skill power is very potent in this build because we are a hybrid firearms stamina build. We do have over 20,000, well over 20,000 skill power that is unconditional being added because of our main stats. Now, that being said, this can be switched out. I do have a decent stamina roll. That's why I've opted to run this backpack, and because of the unconditional skill power, I have a decent armor roll. It's very important to roll that wherever possible, especially on the backpack. Increases mitigation drastically. And for minor attributes, you do want to have ammo capacity, but a resistance doesn't hurt as long as you have ammo capacity at least on your chest piece or your backpack. Either or, but only one is required.
I like where this
now,
is
it is
going.
important to note that you can switch out this piece of high-end gear. If you do opt to run something else, like a Predator's Mark backpack, you can switch that backpack for the Savage Gloves. Now, Savage Gloves will increase DPS drastically. They will also add to the potency of your bleed, so they are a viable alternative. You can also switch it out for a Tenacious Mask or something like Rejuvenated or Enduring. Any one of the masks is probably a good choice. You could switch it out for a different piece of named gear. If you had something like the Kneepads with shortbow Kneepads, if you had something like the Colonel Bliss holster, all of them are great alternatives. But you do not need to run specifically these 2 pieces of high-end gear. As long as you maintain the ratio of main stats, whether it be firearms to stamina in 3:2 or stamina to firearms in 3:2. Last up, we have the Barrett's Bulletproof Vest for our gear. Now, it is very important to note, as I previously stated, this is not integral. You can switch this out at any time. There are a lot of viable alternatives. Number one that comes to mind is Vigorous. That is a very potent alternative to this chest piece and allows you to receive an overheal from your own booster shot as well as all the healing from your teammates. It is something that is very strong in a group composition, but Barret's Bulletproof Vest is probably better for solo play initiatives. Whenever you are going to be tackling rogues solo or dealing with a lot of players, Barret's Bulletproof does have a great talent. But like I said before, it's not integral. The rapid chest piece as well is very, very strong and will increase the frequency at which you can perform your own heals, thus giving yourself bonus burst damage and bonus mitigation since you are using booster shot. Now this can be switched out. I am opting to run it, but I don't want this to deter anyone from running the build just because they think that the Barret's Bulletproof Vest is a cornerstone of the build, because it is not. Now, moving on to the actual rolls on my chest piece, this is kind of the same in every build video that I run this on. I haven't re-rolled anything for a long time here. I have health and armor. That's the premier way to increase toughness, up over 416,000 as a baseline. I am a significantly tanky build, and when I proc other bonuses, I am able to achieve up over 1 million or thereabouts fairly easily. Now, for minor attributes, I do have ammo capacity. Very important to have that on at least one piece of gear, so I'm lucky there. And then for the main stat, I have 1195 firearms. I would prefer over 1200 or 1250 ideally, but this gets the job done very, very well. Moving on to weapons, there are a couple different options here, but I have opted to run a black market AK-74. Now the reason for this is because of the very high base damage. The RPM is still slightly competitive, the mag size is right on par, the enemy armor damage on this gun in particular is very good. I would always look for upwards of 22 to 23% if possible, and the base damage is very, very competitive. That means a stronger bleed every time I can proc it. And yes, the RPM is a little bit lower and is not technically the best in slot weapon in terms of raw DPS right now in the metagame, but it's something that performs very well with this build. For a secondary weapon, I've opted to run an Urban MDR. Now, I understand that this weapon is not very achievable. A lot of people don't have this. However, it is something that you can switch to in situations where you've already bled the target and they are at range. If someone is very far away from you, the Urban MDR has a very, very controllable firing pattern. The RPM is very low, but the damage is quite high. And with enemy armor damage built right in, I've rolled Destructive, Swift, and Distracted. And if I have bled the target, I can gain ground as well as hit them for 10% increased damage on top of the already high base damage of the Urban MDR. And it pairs very well with Predator's Mark. That being said, this is in no way essential to the build. You can run anything else here. You can run a marksman rifle, you could run an LMG or an SMG. It doesn't really matter, whatever your personal preference is, but this is something that does have a lot of potential. Now, also, you can switch out your primary weapon due to the fact that the 3-piece bonus of Predator's Mark is 8% assault rifle and 8% SMG damage. So switching over to like a Navy MP5N or something similar, something like an MP7 as well with very high rate of fire is going to be viable as long as you have the proper talents. Now, for my black market AK, I've opted to run Unforgiving. That is one of the most important talents on console for the Division. This is something I actually get flabbergasted about because a lot of people aren't recognizing how strong this really is. 25% with a tank build or something that can achieve tanky numbers is a lot of damage, and you can reliably achieve this while face trading, and it is going to be active in a lot of situations. So Unforgiving is actually essential to the build in my eyes, and makes it a very, very potent face trading alternative. Also increasing the amount of bleed damage that you do if you do land any of those 10 consecutive shots with that 25% active. Destructive just pairs very nicely, again, with the assault rifle nature of the build. A lot of enemy armor damage wherever it can be rolled. And then Responsive in the third slot, but that can easily be switched out for something like Competent. Responsive is a 10% unconditional bonus when within 10 meters, but Competent can be used at any distance and can be procced very reliably and very easily, and then also feeds into the burst damage aspect when you pop a booster shot, triggering Competent and dealing massively increased damage for those first 10 shots, thus making your bleed much stronger. There's a lot of versatility with the weapons. I'm sorry if that was a mouthful and if I talked for a very long time about these, but this is something that is very variable. You do not need to run this weapon, though it comes highly recommended. Quickly addressing my weapon mods, I have an extended magazine with mag size, critical hit chance, rate of fire. That is not negotiable. You absolutely need that. That's the best combination for this build in terms of increasing raw DPS. For a hand stop, I have reload speed, but you can opt for critical hit damage. That is just as viable and also a very good alternative. I have opted for headshot damage in the suppressor slot. I don't have the best aim in the world, that's kind of no secret, but when I do land headshots, this will increase my DPS drastically. And then for my hollow sight, I have critical hit chance, stability, and headshot damage again. Now, critical hit chance because I'm more comfortable landing body shots a lot of the time, and that will increase the amount of crits that I get, thus increasing my bleed damage. But I do have some headshot damage on there, and since it is a rifle, you can put on a larger scope that will have critical hit damage as the major attribute slot. Now, what we have down here on this Urban MDR is not nearly as important, but it's kind of modded the same way. I have mag size, reload speed this time, and rate of fire, but this isn't very important. I have optimal range since I am going to be using this as my sniper-style long-range gun in secondary encounters. I have critical hit damage, optimal range, and critical hit chance. I would prefer headshot damage. And then I have accuracy, optimal range, and stability. I would prefer headshot damage or critical hit chance as the major there. But again, I'm not going to be even using this in the gameplay, I don't believe. This is just a variable alternative to the build that pairs fairly nicely, and I wanted to talk about and theorycraft a little bit. For every single gear mod, I have stamina with armor. That is the most important thing to roll here. That's what's increasing my toughness over to 416,000 as a baseline. Very important here. You can opt for more firearms if you want to run glass cannon, if you want to be dealing a lot more damage and staying in the back lines, but I would recommend stamina with armor. That's a very good pickup. For every single performance mod, I have first aid self-heal. This increases the survivability of the build. Since you are running booster shot as your main heal, which does not heal for that much as its intrinsic value, 4 different first aid self-heal mods will augment that by 20%, which is a big deal in team fighting or multi-v1 scenarios where you are going up against multiple agents. The first aid self-heal mods are highly recommended. However, if you want to increase your overall DPS, you can opt for something like pulse critical hit chance or pulse critical hit damage. I would not recommend it because a lot of people are running Scrambler in the DZ, but it is one alternative that speaks more towards the DPS nature of the build. Moving on to skills, it's fairly straightforward. You're going to be running 2 skills that are easy to pop since I have the Barrett chest piece on, which means Pulse and Booster Shot. They are both instantly castable on yourself with just one click of a button. I have always opted to run Scrambler whenever I go into the DZ. Concealing yourself from the enemy's pulses and voiding them of that critical hit chance against you is invaluable, and you do not want to run anything other than Scrambler on your pulse in the DZ. And then for Booster Shot, you get the bonus increased damage, which feeds into the power of your bleed if you pop it at the right time. And then you get the bonus increased damage resistance, which keeps you alive in a lot of scenarios. Plus, it has been augmented by the first aid self-heal performance mods that you have in your gear, and thus heals almost 80,000 HP as a baseline. That is very, very potent. However, if I were running the Vigorous chest piece instead of the Barrett's chest piece, it would be even better. So that is something to keep in mind, since this cannot overheal me right now as I am not running the Vigorous chest piece. There are other alternatives. You can run a Flame Turret if you wish to for CC. You can run Smart Cover to increase your mitigation if you want to. You could switch over to a Sticky Bomb with something like the Flashbang mod to, disrupt and blind targets, provide more CC, and then make it easier for you to then stack your bleed on top of it. But it's not essential. I have always opted to run in a solo play perspective, Pulse and Heal. Moving on to my talents, there's a couple key interactions to note here, and the number one thing to realize is that Shrapnel does not stack with Predator's Mark. Whether or not that's intended, right now you cannot bleed a target with Predator's Mark and then apply that bleed to any other targets with Shrapnel. So a lot of people ask me about this, but it's not something that you're going to want to run. I always run Strike Back to increase the frequency at which I can pop my booster shot and increase my mitigation and my burst damage. That is something I find to be very valuable. But as soon as you are in a team play mechanic, you're going to switch Strike Back for Combat Medic to help your teammates. Now, the same thing goes for One is None. Now, while you're solo, this is a very good talent to run. You can switch out One is None, though, as soon as you are in a team for the Triage talent. That is very, very potent. Now, the two that you will not be switching out are On the Move with 30% damage mitigation for 10 seconds when killing a target while moving. That is very easy, and it does proc with the bleed from Predator's Mark. You can bleed a target, get it very low, and then sprint off to a different objective, and then proc On the Move while running there, because you do trigger this talent when you kill something with a bleed. You likewise trigger talents like Talented on a weapon when you kill them with the bleed. There's a lot of different things that will actually, trigger On the Move, so it is very important to note that bleed is one of them. Now, moving on to Critical Save, this is a very potent talent as well. 40% increased damage resistance when you pop a medkit at low health is going to be reliably achievable in pretty much any PvP encounter. When you get to that last segment of health, you pop a medkit, you get that 40% increased resistance, and then you can trade with them, proc your bleed, and then move to a more advantageous position. It's something that is very, very strong, and I would recommend running on any build at all times. Moving on to my character sheet, just in case people have questions, I will mouse over everything, but there's only a couple of things I'm going to address specifically. The first that I want to address is down here in survivability, because a lot of people always ask, what is your survivability? Now, I have mitigation of 54.1 due to the fact that I have high built-in armor rolls on my gear, as well as every single gear mod with 271 armor as well as stamina. That is a very good roll. The higher mitigation you can get, the more toughness you will have, and the easier it is to survive in PvP encounters. The second thing that's important to note is for combat, I have enemy armor damage of 57%. This is very, very high. This will allow me to penetrate the armor of enemy players and deal more base weapon damage, thus making the bleed even stronger. Overall, this build is very competitive. It can trade with pretty much any other build out there, has a lot of utility. You can hunt down rogues very easily. You can slow them with the bleed very reliably, and you can do a lot of damage in a short period of time when proccing your bonuses correctly. Not to mention the fact that you can survive very easily against multiple agents shooting you if you, again, proc your snapshotted bonuses properly in the right order at the right times. So that's it for my character sheet. I will, again, mouse over everything so you guys can see if you want to pause and check out any specific attribute. And now I will kick it over to some live gameplay. Alright, so I'm going to be demonstrating not only the bleed, but the base damage of the gun, and talking about why I've chosen all the different mechanics in this build that I have. So as you can see there, I have very high base damage before snapshots. I didn't have something like booster shot active, and I was still able to deal mass amounts of damage very quickly. As soon as you're taking into consideration other bonuses like booster shot, like unforgiving, etc., maybe even tack advance, you're going to start to see that not only does your base damage go up very, very high, due to the fact that the black market AK-74 already has very high base damage scaling, but you're also dealing significantly increased bleed damage. Another thing to note is that the build is very tanky. Right here you can see I'm taking mass amounts of damage, but all he really did was get me low enough to proc 25% from Unforgiving. As soon as that was procced and I was outside of the shock effect, since he was not able to kill me, I was then able to turn around and deal much more damage than he was prepared to deal with. His heal rotation was blown, and he easily went down. Now, this build excels at 1v1s or 2v1s where you can control the pacing of the fight. Because you can back off and let the bleed keep dealing residual damage, or slow them down, or in pursuit situations you can proc the bleed at will and then gain ground on rogues or something similar. The build excels in allowing you to control the pacing of the fight. It does require tactics, it does require you to be on point, and be smart with your different heals, the way that you use them, and when you proc the bleed. It is actually ideal to proc the bleed directly after they have used their heal to cleanse, but the build really does excel in pretty much anyone's hands. It's something that I am strongly considering using as my primary PvP build. Now that I have finally constructed it, it is finally competitive for me. And it's also important to note that it can trade and out-trade in a lot of situations, something like an Alpha Bridge build, the static cookie cutter meta. This build has very high headshot damage, especially if built in a different way, where you have more headshot damage on your gun's modifiers, on your scope, etc. And it is an extremely competitive build in the hands of someone who can land more headshots, because everything improves the better your aim is. Not only will 10 consecutive body shots land for a strong bleed because of the high base damage on the black market AK-74, 10 headshots, if they do not kill the enemy agent outright, will result in a bleed that can sometimes be upwards of 15 to 20,000. If you can land a 20,000 per tick bleed on a target, they are not going to survive that fight. Unless they cleanse immediately, they are going to blow their heal rotation without even fighting an enemy's weapon DPS, and it results in you essentially controlling the entire fight exactly the way that you want to. Now, it's also important to note that while you are tanky, you have spec'd into stamina with very high armor mitigation, you do have a lot of at-will bonuses you can proc. You can get on the move while running away from a bled target. You will go down to focus fire. Enemy teams will be able to drop you, and the build really excels when you can pick off targets one by one. As soon as you encounter an enemy team and they all turn their weapons towards you, it is going to be a rough ride. So that's going to wrap it up, guys. If you want to support the channel, please check out the links below, and as always, have a nice night.